Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Samantha Dean.
Good evening. Tonight we continue our series Woman as Mother. Our topic is role definition. A lot has been written recently about preparing children for a society in which the traditional masculine and feminine roles are less rigidly structured. That's what we're going to be talking about with our guest, Ms. Wilma Scott Heide. She's a behavioral scientist and the national president of NOW, National Organization for Women. Wilma, how much of the conventional male and female pattern of behavior do you feel is programmed in early childhood, and how much is genetically inherited?
Well, we can't really measure it, but we do know that a good deal of it is programmed. And that is the gender learning, that is the so-called masculine, the so-called feminine. What we also know is that for those few children who say have been born biologically as a boy but raised in terms of gender teaching as a girl, and the reverse in the instance of girls, that the gender learning, this programming, is more difficult to reverse or change than changing the biological sex of either the girl or the boy. And that ought to tell us something about the impact and the influence of this programming or the gender learning.
Sex differentiation does occur in the brain, though. There is a different chromosome pattern for a man and for a woman. And how easy is it, do you think, to create a sexual flexibility given this biological factor?
Well, we won't really know those things that are uniquely and innately male, and those things that are innately and uniquely female until such time we reach the point that we cease defining the social and the psychological roles of girls and boys and of women and men based on the assumptions that those differences that do exist should make all the difference in terms of the kinds of roles people will play as adults. We are well aware of what the differences are between the sexes, but we are also aware that whatever those differences, they need not, and indeed we believe should not, make all the difference in terms of the life opportunities, the expectations, and the kinds of behaviors that are differentially rewarded for boys and girls, beginning indeed from the second of birth.
So the other biological differences, for instance, menstruation in a woman, gestation, lactation, impregnation in a man, you feel that these also would not condition us or psychologically affect us to such an extent that they would constrict or impede our sexual flexibility?
Yeah, that's right. I think they do make some difference, but not the kind of difference. They make a difference, of course, in our sexuality, but they do not make the difference in terms of the capacities of individuals to perform any kind of role outside of the reproductive area. We know that there's nothing in the world to stop the possibility of a woman doing anything except being a sperm donor. That's the only thing that no woman can do or be qualified to do. Just as we know that there are only two things that no man can do or be qualified to do as far as we know, to be a human incubator or a wet nurse. Now once we understand that, then we can begin to raise our children along individually appropriate lines, according to individual interest, individual aptitudes, and individual inclinations. And this is the sort of thing that we think is appropriate to begin doing in more ways than we have.
Do you think it's necessary to normal heterosexual behavior?
Which? The
fact that you eliminate as much as you can of these trappings, these socially acceptable.
Well, I think it's necessary to heterosexual behavior and indeed homosexual behavior, and for that behavior that is bisexual or asexual. We really know very little about the full potential of human sexuality. We know that we've been taught, for instance, that homosexuality is not normal. Apparently it is for some people. But until we let people free to develop along lines that's compatible with their own natures, not somebody else's notion, we really won't know what's natural.
Mm-hmm. Scientists sometimes say that it is dangerous to cross over these sexual boundaries, so to speak, and try to oppose the natural biological behavior. What do you think are the advantages of doing this?
Well, first I must note that most of the scientists are men, and they have very often the usual cultural biases and limitations in their conception, and have had. Or they are women who've had to accommodate to these male-oriented conceptions. Your question was, what are the dangers or the advantages?
What are the advantages
of
actually, the question was, what are the advantages of crossing over these lines and cultivating more flexible behavior in males and females?
The advantages are enormous. I don't think I'd look at it in terms of crossing over the lines, because I think the lines are created by people so they can be removed by people. The advantages are in terms of the individuality. The fact that we won't have so many people as we do now, whether it's identified as that or not, as children or as adults, trying to conform to a role definition and trying to behave along ways simply because they are a male or a female, when it is at odds with their own interests and inclination and aptitudes. So what we are speaking to is the individuality of the child and of the adult. The advantages beyond that, in terms of people simply being comfortable with themselves, are in terms of the enormous talent that we think will be released, and the enormous kinds of insights that we have not yet had in terms of human behavior and its potential, that we are quite sure that we already are beginning to see as we begin to get feminists doing behavioral research, without starting out with the givens or premises that make the assumption that those things that have been normal are indeed those things which are natural. And normal and natural, of course, are not the same things at all.
Well, if you want to bring up your child to have more mobility within this framework, what age do you have to start about it?
Well, from the second of birth, and really before that, in terms of thinking about becoming a parent and thinking about what it would be like to have a girl or to have a boy. And also in terms of the fact that we are aware that now and for some time, boys are preferred. And I think it's very interesting they are, because I think that what this reflects is the notion that the kind of role definition made for boys, the sort of ready-made me that is there, that the boys are to conform to for girls, for boys, it means that it's a facilitating sort of thing. And we've got to develop this person's potential. We know that there are all kinds of possibilities available for him as an adult, and he's probably also going to become a parent. Whereas for the girl, the ready-made me is the sort of thing where there's some possibilities for her as an adult. She also, in equal numbers, is going to become a parent. But we make that parent role, presumably, first of all, her having little choice psychologically, because she's rewarded for behavior that is directed toward her becoming a parent, toward her becoming a wife, toward her becoming a mother. And she's rewarded in terms of the differential way that we handle children. We handle girls as if they were more delicate than boys, when actually, of course, the female is constitutionally, not muscularly, stronger than the male is. From the second of conception, the female organism is constitutionally a stronger organism. We do it in terms of the differential blankets, you know, the pink blanket for the girl and for the boy, the fact that we respond more to a girl when she cries, a girl infant, than a boy, in the roughness of the handling, in terms of, as time goes on, in terms of allowing a girl to cry and almost encouraging it and expecting it, because, you know, everybody knows that women are presumably more emotional than men are and so forth, and other similar mythologies. We do it in terms of the kinds of toys that we give. We start very early to give dolls to girls and discourage little boys from having dolls, or discourage it beyond a very young age, when boys too will become parents. And boys and men have the capacity and the potential to be nurturant, to be caring, and to be sensitive. But we deny this to boys, just as we deny boys crying. You know, we say to a little boy who's hurt, be a man. When he's not a man, he's a human, he's equipped to cry. We must allow him to be free to do that, because there are situations where indeed crying is the only appropriate response, and that is natural. We are equipped with that, females and males. So it's in every aspect of the life, the way we relate to children, the kinds of toys we give, the expectation behavior, what we reward. We let boys go further to play. Boys can get dirtier than girls can. They can experiment more. They're encouraged when they go in for problem solving. If they don't solve it the first time, they're encouraged to go back, and they're told that they're not going to be a man if they don't, you know, face it, overcome barriers. Whereas with girls, if they sense the difficulty, they will get support if they are inclined to cry about it or think it's too difficult, because we make the assumption that it is too difficult. Why? Not because of the individual, but because this is a female. So there are thousands of things like this that go on in our everyday lives, and still go on much too much.
You know, so many people empathize completely with what you're saying, but feel that they're fighting a losing battle because they have been conditioned and programmed to affect such a mode of behavior in their own life. And children learn by example, and no matter what you say about what you should do and how you should be, they still see mother poring over the kitchen stove and father going off to the office. So what can you do to remedy this?
Well, I think we've started to do it. We've only started. This rebirth of feminism is just a little over 6 years old, depending on how you date it. That's when now started. But I think it is happening. There are people who are self-consciously trying to raise their children according to their individual potential and provide a variety of models for them of women and men as competent adults in and outside the home. So that it's not only a matter of men helping around the home and helping with child care. We don't even make the assumption that femaleness is a bona fide occupational qualification for child care, or that being a male is a disqualification for child care. See, that's the first thing. So it isn't a matter of helping, because if you're helping somebody else, then you assume that it's really somebody else's job. You're just being good enough to help out. So we don't make any assumptions about who should be the primary breadwinner, who should be the primary child winner. We've got the people concerned work that out themselves. So that children must see these models. They must see these models in the home, among their friends. They must see them in the schools. They must see women and men as teachers, women and men as administrators. They must see them in the mass media of communications. Even the technically well-produced Sesame program has much of the sex role stereotyping that reinforces the same patterns. So it's a matter of the behavior that we support and encourage, the individually appropriate behavior, and seeing models outside the home, the question of what children learn when they get in school, so that there are not the sex-segregated programs, there are not these textbooks in schools that, again, stereotype, that have very few models of any women, and women in very limited roles that don't even reflect present reality, let alone the potential of women. This has enormously damaging effect. There's also the whole question of the language itself, which is what we call manglish. You know, man, the generic for people, when it really means male, and using he, his, and him for a person, sex unspecified. What I'm talking about is every aspect of life. Now, about people getting discouraged, I suppose those of us who are active in this, what I call profound behavioral revolution, are incurable optimists, and we don't even think we're sick. So I think we have started to make some progress, but only begun, and we are addressing ourselves to all of our social institutions. But it is very important in terms of the role definitions. First of all, we don't make the definition for somebody else.
Supposing you come to this feeling when your child is, let's say, the age of 8 or 10, can you bring about certain changes in that child, or would it be likely to have sort of traumatic effects later on upon his personality development, and perhaps bring about feelings of insecurity and inadequacy with his role?
I think it's simply harder the later we start. I don't think it's impossible. And I think the way it makes problems is if we try to make a reversal. For instance, if we assume that those kinds of things that are considered appropriate for women are not appropriate for any girl that we know. See, some girls and women will find at least parts of this compatible with their own nature, just as some boys will. I think the thing is to have the kind of climate of learning and loving, if you will, and caring, so that the child will feel comfortable and accepted whatever she or he does, that as long as it's not harmful.
What do you feel about instincts? Is this another cultural myth? Is there such a thing as a maternal instinct, or can this be?
Well, I think there's a parental instinct, and it's interesting that it's been called a maternal instinct. For instance, I think it's interesting that seldom, if I ever see any programs are thought given to man as a father, just as we're talking about woman as a mother. And I think that's something for people to think about. I've got to ask you again what you said. I lost my train of.
The instinct is. Is there such a thing?
There is a parental instinct, but as a matter of fact, if we go back into history, and it is his story, not her story, what we find is that men have had this, but they have exhibited, in today's terms, the kind of, they've exhibited like the Ben Spocks and the Bruno Bettelheims in the high status, lucrative positions. And as a matter of fact, there have been periods of time when women had to be taught to have this maternal, caring kind of behavior. You know, there have been periods of time in different civilizations where women were very destructive to their children. And they had to be taught. And it was men who indeed had the so-called maternal or the parental caring inclinations, I will call, rather than instincts. But they did it not from the standpoint of doing the day-to-day work, considered by some people kind of crappy work, you know, and the emotional support for children and so forth. But they did it from the high status, you know, giving the advice sort of thing, and are still doing it today. So what we say is these men that have had these inclinations and interests must also have the opportunity to have the day-to-day caring and not be teased or not discouraged from doing this sort of thing. There are men, you know, and we're beginning to realize this as we look into it, who like very much being with children and who do very well. And after all, a lot of it is physical work.
I was going to ask you, what do you think is the effect of the children in school on having predominantly women teachers?
Well, I think that in the early grades, for those teachers who are women, who have been conditioned and have bought the feminine mystique, that only certain things are appropriate for women and not so appropriate for men, and vice versa. I think that it has had what's been called a feminizing influence, but it's still done in the schools, even if all the teachers are women, in the context of a male-oriented and a male-administered educational system, and in a male-oriented and a male-dominated culture. So who does it isn't the only thing that makes a difference. But it is true that in the early grades, it is easier for girls, with all their other conditioning or programming, to adapt to a kind of school system that is very rigid, requires children to be quiet for a long period of time, long periods of time, more really than is comfortable for girls or boys, and that it is particularly more difficult for boys, given their programming and cultural conditioning, to be active and to find it more difficult to be quiet and so forth and so on. So it does have an effect in the early grades. Now later, there's a different effect, where the boys' varied interests are encouraged and the girls are either subtly or blatantly discouraged in counseling programs, again with the textbooks, and in the sex-segregated programs.
Do you think in the schools there should be perhaps more emphasis on physical education for girls in building up bodily strength with perhaps judo and fencing and encouraging physical confidence?
The figures differ from school system to school system, but on the average we found across the country that about 10 times as much of public funds, that's of all of our funds in public schools, is given for physical education programs for boys as is for girls. And that's not counting the interscholastic education. Now what this does, and the nature of the physical education programs for girls, is it reinforces the notion that it teaches girls and women the disabilities of being a female, rather than teaching them the abilities, the potential of being a female, the kinds of things that we're learning we can do. You know, it's no accident that as part of the feminist movement that women are taking their own physical education, judo, karate. Now, whatever the motivations for taking this, one of the very healthy results is the self-confidence. And it's self-confidence that is destroyed, whatever the motivation, in girls so young and in so many ways. And one of the ways is girls being taught in the thousands of ways the kinds of things we cannot do, instead of learning the thousands of things we can do that we've never even tried. Mm-hmm. Education should be developing our individual potential, not telling us in any way things we can't do, but facilitating for all of us, girls and boys and adults, the things that we can do.
Do you notice any changes? I mean, with all this talk and this awareness of what we should be doing, do you notice any changes?
I think the changes in individual lives are numerically fairly small in the very obvious kinds of ways. I think the qualitative changes, which in the long run are the ones that will make the difference, are the ones that I see happening in terms of people's awareness. This is a subject, you know, that wasn't even discussed just a few years ago. Now, and it's some 400 chapters around the country, has been, I think, in the vanguard, individual volunteers doing studies in the schools of this conditioning. We have gotten some legislation that will prohibit this as we get this enforced. We have gotten in Pennsylvania the Secretary of Education to make a commitment as a priority to get rid of sexism in the schools. That's a healthy thing. So we will be moving on this coming year. This will be, I think, a priority of more and more attention, not only of NOW, but of feminists who aren't at this point members of NOW. And I think it's a very important and a very healthy kind of development.
Mm-hmm. Let's get back to the male and female child for a moment. Do you think that it's also sort of rather dangerous what's happening with the male and female stereotype regarding dating? I mean, the male is automatically thought of as the predator, the female is the prey. Do you think we're a long way off the time when the girl will also be able to choose who she dates and who she marries? I think
this is already happening more and more. I happen to have two teenage daughters, and I can tell you that there's some difference if the boys they're interested in belong in homes where they think it would be terrible for the girl to call. But I think that this is already, that part of it's already beginning to happen. The thing that I feel more concerned about and less hopeful about is the whole emphasis on sexuality, and from a narrow kind of concept of that. For instance, we place so much emphasis on sex in a very narrow sense. Sex is, you know, the greatest, however exhilarating and exciting and gratifying this experience can be, and it is, at least for many, I think not all people, but for many. The fact remains to put so much in terms of expectations of that, I think is due to a lot of things, one of which is that there are very few things that people can do, and this is particularly true for men as we become more mechanized and things, which people can get satisfaction from physical things. This used to be much more true for men in an earlier day, where it wasn't just a matter of a game or a sport, but what they did made a difference. Mm-hmm. you see. Now they know it's a game, and it may make a difference if they're, you know, professional athletes or something like that. So that more emphasis and greater expectations are placed, and there is therefore more anxiety in terms of what one's physical, and it's not, of course, only physical, but the total experience of that one has with one's sexuality. That is a sort of thing that I feel very concerned about. And of course the fact of that I think people have thought about and heard about more and more is that the whole question of woman as a sex object raised as that from the moment of birth, that she must please men, and that you know, she supposedly should be very happy if she's called a girl when she's obviously an adult. That whole phenomenon, the very fact that many women are pleased by this and considered more feminine, the very fact that women are more valued in our youth, whereas men, as they get older, we take a look at the fact that, you know, they've got more wisdom and more experience, hopefully, if not realistically. That differential, which is part of, you know, the whole role definition that makes such a difference, the great investment that girls and women make in being sexually pleasing. There are some changes occurring. I think we've got an awful long way to go in that.
By way of a closing question, I'd like to ask you if you know any societies in the world where there is greater sexual flexibility, where it's actually working.
I think most societies that we know of in the world, and I think there's a lot we don't know, and I remind you again that we've heard history and not her story, not yet, have by and large have divided labor along sex lines. But there are some few, and they are few, where quite the reverse is true than what's been traditionally true in our culture, where the men take care of the children, and the men take care of the home, and the men preen themselves, as they do in our culture, but they do it more honestly and openly in these other cultures. And the women are the community representatives, and the women are the breadwinners. And they think that our behavior is very strange because, of course, men are generally stronger than women. And the work at the home, the work of taking care of the children, a lot of it is very physical. And of course the men's the appropriate one. And of course men, you know, if you think of the peacock syndrome, a male, of course they're going to preen themselves and they want to be attractive for the women and so forth. So this alone, however rare it is in the culture, tells us, because humans are very much the same the world around, basically, tells us that these are programmed and culturally learned.
Well, I couldn't think of a more optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much, Wilma Scott Heide, and good night from Woman.